Hey, it's Adam with Tech Dive AV Club, and we're in Vegas Pro 17, and today we're going to look at specs, computer specs, and is Vegas working well with those specs, and some ways you can tell. So this isn't going to be a computer science course, and I know that some of you have a lot of experience with computers, and some of you only have very little and don't feel very comfortable in the computer arena. But here, we're going to talk a little bit about where your computer and your editing software meet. So first off, Task Manager has some information about what Vegas is doing. Meanwhile, Vegas also has some information about what Vegas is doing, and it might seem to conflict. How do you see this information right here? Well, first you need to ctr-shift-O. And if you do that, you can toggle this menu right here. Make sure you have it'll pop up on the active monitor, and then you see a lot of information, some of which looks a bit different than what Windows is saying is the case. Now, that's okay. First off, I'm not a software developer. I can tell you though that softwares do allocate certain amounts to themselves. They'll kind of say, this is what's safe to use, or this is what I'm expecting to use. So I can tell you that Vegas is currently using about 4 gigs of RAM, but it's kind of pulled 8.1 gigs to itself, and this might go up throughout the video. Now, that's okay, because even if it's using 8 gigs of RAM, you want it to have that space to breathe. So already off the bat, I can tell you that if you only have 4 gigs of RAM in your computer, for any video editing software, that's low. And if you're editing high-def footage, especially 4K footage, that's low. You probably only get away with 720p or 1080p with that little bit of RAM. You really need at least 8 gigs, but definitely 16 gigs of RAM is what I would definitely suggest. More RAM's better, obviously, right? But and I talk about more. I have a whole video talking about what to build for a computer. But I'm just going to hit a couple little highlights here as it matters to Vegas. But I'll link that video, how to build a 4K editing computer, if you're more interested in diving into what a good 4K editing computer looks like. But in particular, I'm just saying this 4 gigs is used right off the bat, right? I only got a couple clips in here, and I'm viewing it without a proxy or anything. And so that's very interesting, right? But I want to show you here too. Vegas is using the most memory right now, but it says it's not using any CPU. That's not quite true. This isn't 100% exactly what's going on either. This kind of gives you just a good active picture. And the GPU is in high utilization because of OBS. It doesn't. It's kind of hiding it from me right now, but I know that OBS is using my GPU to capture this video right now. OBS is open broadcast software. So that's another thing to keep in mind. If you're editing, you may have other programs fighting for your space. So if you're running applications in the background, I know there are lots of applications that you might be running in the background that are borrowing some of your CPU power. So some days things seem to crash a lot and run slow, and other days everything's fine. That may be related to you having too many window browsers open or stuff like that. High definition video editing, you really ought to look at getting something with a dedicated GPU, or at least a CPU like an Intel CPU or an AMD APU with integrated graphics inside of it. So something that's got extra graphical capabilities. So cheap laptops are really out the door when you're looking at editing. And it's becoming more and more important. And so Vegas Pro 17 uses your GPU more than any of the other versions, and it uses it actively in the timeline. It doesn't just render with the GPU. It actually helps use your GPU to work with this footage here. When you watch it and things like that, it'll actually use the CPU and the GPU together. This CPU util, that's your CPU utilization. Like I said, it's going to have different numbers than your Task Manager because they really have different bars for where they're getting these numbers, but this is what Vegas thinks, right? And that's what we're concerned about, is what Vegas thinks. And it thinks it's using 15, 14%, and 5%, 3% of the CPU. It's going to go all over the place. If you're seeing 100% usage on the CPU at a regular interval, your computer is really not strong enough to edit the kind of video you're editing. And your CPU is what your computer uses to think, and it needs to be able to run Windows and Vegas. So if you're hitting 100% at any point, that's not great, but it may happen from time to time. Now, we're not talking about rendering. I'm talking about active projects. We're going to talk about rendering in a second. But if you have a high CPU usage all the time, that's a flag that you might need to upgrade your computer. If your RAM usage isn't having the room to breathe, like if you want more RAM, but it doesn't really have the opportunity to get 8 gigs of RAM, I would highly suggest you need more RAM. Really, 8 gigs is the minimum to have a video editing computer, but 16 gigs, see, I have 16 gigs of RAM, and it's utilizing 8 of those. That's half of my RAM being tied up for video editing, and that's normal. It's normal for that kind of, this kind of computation. What VRAM is that is RAM for your GPU. Your GPU is a specialized CPU that does video type work. It does graphics type work. What it does is it's specialized for that kind of math. And it can do it really well and better than your CPU. Your CPU is a jack of all trades, and your GPU is graphics only, man, or encryption, but that's another story. So your GPU in Vegas Pro 17 will be utilized a lot more than your than in other versions of Vegas, because in Vegas Pro 17 they've designed it to use your GPU more, and I think all video editors are going that direction, where your GPU, they're tapping into that untapped in power, and it makes sense because you're editing graphical stuff, so tapping into your GPU is a great idea. And that means you're going to need more GPU stuff. So I have 8 gigs of VRAM in my GPU. That is a little bit overkill. However, you know, a typical gaming card might have 2 to 4, and we're already using 1.3. So having a dedicated GPU with actual VRAM would be good. Now, what if you have an APU, or if you have an Intel integrated graphics, and you're like, well, that's my GPU. Well, yes, and so it may still show up as GPU utilization here. I can't test that exactly. Let me know in the comments if I'm wrong. But one thing you need to know is that actually borrows some of your normal RAM for the VRAM. So your VRAM usage will take away from your overall RAM, making RAM even more important to have. So that's things to keep in mind. So if you're seeing these max out against your computer, then that is an issue. If your GPU is hitting 100%, if your CPU is hitting 100%, and you're regularly there, then that could be a big problem. So one thing I want to do is I want to go ahead and just drag in like a ton of footage at once, and I want to look at it all and add some effects, and I want to see really kind of what's happening to the computer. Alright, so I'm dragging in just a ton of high-def footage right now and just straight to the timeline, and let's take a look at this. So suddenly my RAM utilization kind of jimmies around and then jumps back up actually. It went down for some reason. None of this really changed, though, except the GPU utilization is kind of held steady at 8 for a little while. So that's interesting. One thing that your computer does is it builds these audio peaks. Now, this is an example that I have a CPU that's sized for this kind of workload. If you pull in a bunch of stuff at one time and you're waiting for like an hour for this little bar down here to go away, and it says building peaks, building peaks, building peaks, that would be a sign to me that your CPU isn't strong enough. Now, notice this is jumping around a lot more now, and that's normal because I have a lot more in my timeline. So this normal kind of jumping is fine. We're gonna play some. But what I'm saying is, if it jumps up and it maxes out over and over again, then that would be a red flag. So this is just a bunch of different HD footage of some mountains. This is in the raw. Now, if you're having these kinds of issues, using a proxy edit is a great idea. I'll link that video as well. So see, there's a little bit of stuttering now as it's watching it, and that's because it's live showing me this raw footage with stitching it together to the other pieces of footage here. So now let's go ahead and let's start adding some effects. Let's do something really graphic intensive. Let's add a spear eyes effect to all this beautiful footage, and boom, now it's awkward looking. See, it's live rendering that, and so now my CPU utilization kind of jumps up, and the GPU went down, and then it jumped back up, and you're not going to see just a steady numbers on these things. Your CPU will be utilized more than your GPU, because even though your GPU is helping more now, it's not necessarily what's fixing it. It's not carrying most of the load. The CPU is still carrying most of the load. So again, we just added an effect to a whole lot of stuff. Now I'm going to do something fun. I'm going to layer some things. So now this is layered. We're going to lower the opacity. Now the effect should go away on the top video because I added it to the track, so this is in a different track now. So now we're watching 2 high-def videos at once. We're up to 50. So you see that made the GPU jump. Ooh, see the GPU jumped to 91%. I have an RX 480. That is I play VR games on this graphics card. Great. It is a high-level graphics card. Now it's not the highest level graphics card, but it made my high-level graphics card jump up. Now that doesn't mean that you can do this. I've edited great 4K footage very well on like RX 560, which is a much cheaper card. So I'm not saying you have to all the time have the best the world offers on this stuff, but I am saying that you can see how a muscle in a computer really matters. So let's make it even crazier. Let's go ahead and add. Oh, this is a video track. Let's delete that. It's in the wrong way. Okay, so put that down there, and then let's add another track. Control-Shift-Q. Boom. So now we got more footage up here, and let's add something crazy to that. Let's see, a TV simulator, bad sync. Boom. So now this is going, and I want it to be see-through. So now we're seeing 3 high-def videos at once, all having different effects on them. You can see we're running this in best auto. What if I ran this in best full? Now I'm really going to be using my computer. See, so best full is no holds bar. It's fully computing all of this. Now look, my RAM utilization is jumping up, my CPU utilization is jumping up, and my GPU utilization will continue to fluctuate as it's grabbed and used. But you can see here that this is getting rough to watch, and so it's even hard to kind of pause the video there. So now let's go to draft auto. This is the quick way to proxy. Look at that. Now it's showing it in like real time. It's using a little bit less of VRAM, and it's easier on my CPU. And look, for some reason my GPU is now jumping up, and I think it's because it's being handed the processes faster from the CPU. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. But man, that horse looks gnarly. So if you have a GPU and you're not seeing any GPU utilization, you really ought to go to options, preferences, and then go to video. And you need to make sure that your GPU acceleration is on, this optimal setting here. Advanced micro devices, I have an AMD graphics card, so that's AMD, advanced micro devices. If you have NVIDIA, it'll say NVIDIA here. If you have Intel integrated graphics, it'll say Intel integrated graphics. but you need this selected if you're going to get the GPU benefit right there. Now, another thing people do is they're like, oh, dynamic RAM preview? Maybe I should make this go up, 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 up. The problem is this actually takes away from some of the RAM that Vegas is allocated for other things. So, making this go up isn't always the best idea. Sometimes this can cause crashes. In fact, it'll warn you about it when you move it. I think 200 is the default. I usually just add about 50. I've added as high as 400 before, but I did start seeing issues. And I think a lot of people, when they tell me I'm seeing frequent crashes, I'm like, did you mess with this? And they're like, no. And I go and look, and there's like 5,000 in here. And I'm like, well, maybe I messed with it one time. But this is, this is a big deal. It's not intuitive in the way you would think, where more is better in this scenario. So if you have a computer like mine, where it's got a little bit of muscle to it, my computer's not the muscliest computer in the world, but it's got some muscle, right? And if you have a computer that's got a fair amount of muscle, raising this a small bit, like I raised it 50, raising this a small bit will give you a little bit better performance. Raising it a lot won't necessarily give you better performance. This max available is just a raw number. It doesn't necessarily mean you need to get close to that number. So those are two things about the preferences in your GPU and your RAM settings that really can affect your performance. And now we're going to render things. So I'm going to render this loop region of this craziness I got here. And when I go to render as, there's a few things I want to note here as well. So here I can render as 4K, and it says AMD VCE. This will use my graphics card to render. Now, if I use this one right here, well, that's just a different frame rate. If I use this one right here, right above it, it will do the same render, but it will use my CPU to do the render. And it'll actually be a little bit slower because my CPU is not as good at that kind of stuff. But if you're having issues rendering anything out, maybe you should try the CPU. Maybe your CPU can handle that kind of computation better. So that's just something to do, something to check. But as you're doing this, you might see NVIDIA here, like I have AMD, but it may say NVIDIA or it may say Intel, QSV. These are just things that are designed to be compressed with those special graphics, or created with those special graphics offloading. And so you don't necessarily have to use your GPU if it's giving you issues. So something else I want to point out is when you render it, look at my GPU utilization. But if you go here, this is actually a little bit more telling right now. In your task manager, my GPU utilization is way up. Now, the reason why it's almost 100% usage is because I'm also screen capturing while rendering. But you can see here too, it still uses my CPU. So if you're saying, I have a big GPU, why do I still have slogging issues? It may be because you don't realize that your CPU and your GPU are always working together. And so your CPU is always doing the majority of the lifting, even when you're doing this kind of computation, because it's got to hand your GPU the math problems. It's like the math teacher. It's got to hand out the math problems for your GPU to do. So while it's working on that, see, this is a little more true about the CPU utilization. There we go. That jumped up to 84%, 59%. So now this is a little bit more telling. You can see it doesn't hold numbers. It just kind of gives you what the sample says. This is why render times are different on everyone's machines. Alright, so this has been a look at what your computer is really doing under the hood and how it's really working with Vegas. And so hopefully I can't give you a specific suggestion for everybody's computer, but I hope I gave you some general places to start when you're investigating. Is your computer good enough to edit video? And thank you so much for watching. Remember, anything you buy through my affiliate links help me out. If you're new, it helps me out a ton. If you're new to editing, we have Udemy tutorials. I would love for you to check those out, and I think they would help you out a lot. We edit 3 different projects together. Thank you so much for watching. This has been one of the 50 videos. I'm about to go and count and see how far behind I am for the 50 videos marathon. I will see you next time.